Hi, and welcome to Studio 275 for this week's Tim's Top Tips. I firstly want to start to thank the people that watched last week's and the people that commented. There were some interesting comments, and I'm going to pick up on some of those comments in what we're talking about this week. I think there was just a comment made by me at the end of last week about taking a few singers down the pub to run through a piece that you'd written to see how singers coped with that piece and whether it worked for them or not. And I think actually that's a very useful tip as well for a beginning conductor. Rather than going in front of a choir when you're starting out and making a fool of yourself, it's a good idea to see if you can conduct 3 or 4 of your singers in a round before starting on a full choir. So I've got 5 top tips again this week, but these are slightly different. The first one I want to talk about is, can you actually teach composition in the first place? And there are varied opinions on this. After all, Elgar was largely self-taught and regarded self-tuition as probably the finest form of tuition, because you pick to choose what it is that you want to learn about rather than following a set syllabus that's regurgitated. But then lots of composition pupils or students say that they're constantly upset because their teacher doesn't like the things that they've written. And that's really a strange point, because I don't think it is a teacher's position whether they like what you've written or not. It's whether or not whether what you've written will work, is musically, grammatically correct, rather than the actual content. The actual content of the piece of music can't be wrong because it's what the person wanted to write. But of course it can be wrong in the way it's written down. It can be wrong in the way it maybe doesn't work for the instruments or the voices that the student has selected. So I think if you are going for a composition teacher, and the tip is that you really do need to be clear what you want out of the relationship with that teacher, so that you can, in advance, before you actually start any course of lessons, know where it's going. I think that's good advice for people going for singing lessons as well. The teacher will be hard pressed to help you if they don't actually know what it is you want. And for a composition teacher, if you really want to learn the workings of Palestrina's counterpoint, that's absolutely fine. But if you're actually writing film music, actually it just reminded me of a pupil that came to me, and they were at Leeds University studying composition, and they wanted to be a film composer, and they came to the college because they'd been sent out on the main road to record the sounds of traffic and turn that into a string quartet. Well, I'm not saying that there isn't any value in that, but it clearly wasn't what that pupil needed. That pupil actually has gone on to write lots of music for short films. And what he really wanted to know about was orchestration, which he wasn't going to get from the sounds of traffic passing on Otley Road. So tip 1, if you are looking for a composition teacher, make sure that you know exactly what you want from the relationship with your teacher, and that they therefore will either be able to say, yes, I can help you with that, or no, I can't help you with that. I think now we're going to move on to the actual starting of a piece. And Tamsin made a very important point in the comments. When you've decided what the instruments are or the voices are that you're going to write for, you really can't be writing for a violin if you've no idea of the range of the violin, or likewise a trumpet or a saxophone. I don't think even I would consider writing for the harp, because it's a very complex instrument, and yet you could actually book a lesson with a harp teacher for the harp teacher to explain to you the basic principles of how the instrument works, so that, I mean, I remember reading an article once where a harp teacher had said, or a harp player had said they'd be given a piece, and it was perfectly clear from the way the piece was written. The person had no idea how the instrument worked, and that really there is no excuse for. And I suppose there is a tip that comes in here that says write for the instrument that you know or that you play. I'm reminded of thinking of the organ music of Max Reger. When you look at the page, it really does look like a cat has knocked over an ink pot and walked all over the page. And then you notice that it says Adagio. And you start to play it, and you find in actual fact it fits perfectly under the hands because that was the instrument of the composer. So, tip 2, write for the instrument you know. Or if you really do want to write for an instrument that you don't know much about, then find a teacher. Or ask to attend an orchestral rehearsal. But make sure that what you put down on paper is playable and understandable by the person who is going to play it. What you're trying to say in a piece of music and how long it might take to say that. People do often ask that, how long should the piece of music be? Well, the piece of music should be as long as it takes to say what the piece of music is trying to say. To know that, of course, you have to know the mood of the piece. Sometimes it's very clear by the instruction, by the title of the piece, what the piece is going to be about. So, if the piece is called Sunrise over Saltburn, which actually I've seen, I can't imagine nowadays that I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to see Sunrise over Saltburn. Never mind Sunrise over Saltburn. But that would give you an idea of what the piece was going to be like. Likewise, if the piece was called, I don't know, Funeral Sentences for Moggy the Cat, is also going to give you an idea. But I don't think you can set out with a blank piece of manuscript paper unless you do have an idea, a clear idea, what the piece is going to be about, the mood of the piece, which will therefore probably reflect the speed of the piece, the title of the piece. So my tip is, again, to have everything worked out in your head about the piece before you start it, or it will wander and it will eventually go nowhere. And this is back to the scoring part that we mentioned last week, the sketching out of a picture before you start work on it. And whilst we're dealing with text here, or could be dealing with text, no amount of good music is going to save a bad text. And the singers will want to sing the text, and there are hundreds and thousands of pieces of text that come out of copyright each year that you may look at. You need to delve deeply. I'm minded to think that lots of people set God be in my head and in my understanding, etc. But I don't think that one is ever going to better the setting by Walford Davis of that text. And I think there's another thing to consider here. It may be a strange thing for a composer to consider, but choirs have a budget. And if choirs are going to buy your piece of music, and the text you've set is a text that's already been set umpteen times, then yours is clearly going to have to say something very special about that text for it to be bought and to go in the choir library. So I would have a tip that said, select texts that are relevant and haven't been used many times before, unless you absolutely do have something new to say about that text. About using texts that are in copyright, that's something that we're going to cover in a later video. And finally, a tip for today, which is going to lead us on to next week, where we're going to start talking about melodies. I'm going to play you a piece of music, and I was once told jokingly that this was the finest melody ever written by anybody at any time. Well, of course I might be joking, although the person who told me wasn't joking, because that is a melody that everybody knows. It is incredibly memorable, but it doesn't waffle. It says something, it reuses something that it thinks is important, and makes a completely self-contained melody. Now, I'm part joking, I'm part serious. When we talk about melodies next week, we'll see why that is a sensible foundation melody to look at in the way it's made. So, tips for today concerning teaching. If you are going to find a composition teacher, make sure that you and they know what you want from the relationship. Writing for instruments or voices, either write for the instrument, start out by writing for the instrument that you know. If you don't know about the instrument, then do go find a teacher or read up about the instrument. But in actual fact, reading up is never actually going to be as good as being shown practically how the instrument will work. Writing the piece, make sure that everything is worked out in your head or on a sketchpad. What it is you're trying to say, and that will give you then a framework to start building the music. If you're selecting texts, my next tip would be to be careful about using texts that have been used many times before for a variety of reasons. There are, if you go delving, lots of wonderful texts that are both sacred and secular that you could use without reusing one that has been used many times before. And then the final tip really is back to the sketchpad. It is back to the sketchpad to make sure that before you start the piece, which we are going to make a start on next week, that you have worked everything out. So, before I start waffling and go on too long saying what I need to say, I'm a Yorkshireman. We generally say what we're going to say and shut up, although I'm often accused of saying too much. I hope you'll find something interesting in this, and again, we'll see you next week. Comments welcome, please subscribe, please share if you think anybody will be interested. Bye.